Well, welcome everybody who's joining us for this live stream, and also for those who will be watching this as a recording later. The topic we have to discuss tonight is a difficult one because it concerns what happens when good religion becomes bad. Any religion, that is, not just Christianity. And in so doing, we may touch upon certain things that are highly sensitive for people watching or listening here. I'm just warning you that this may not be something that is fitting for those of a young age or for those who have been wounded in the past by abusive practices in the church. If this is the case and you would prefer not to either see or listen to this, then please close down the window now. Thank you. But for the rest of us who are listening and seeing, I want to now hand over to Philip Williams, who's going to introduce this session tonight with 15 or 20 minutes of some input, and then we'll have a discussion. I will have a shorter contribution, followed by a little discussion around mine, and then we will have a roundup at the end, which I shall hand back over to Phil. So, Phil, may the Lord strengthen your arm and equip your voice and mind. Off you go.
Okay, thank you, Father Gregory. Yeah, I've got the what I'm going to present there. Just trying to do the share screen thing. Yep, here it is. Can everybody see that? Harmful Religion? Thoughts based on Dr. Andrew Walker's 1995 essay of that title. Just by way of introduction, Father Gregory said to warn people that they're in for a bumpy ride. I think that's possibly the case, but I would also like to say that as with Lent, there is hope. And that I think we need to remind ourselves that in this is that people do survive harmful religion, people do come through it, and there are answers there. That's not to elide everything or minimize it, but it's not to sort of frighten us all away, because there are ways of dealing with these things, and I want to sort of touch on some of those in the presentation. I've based it very closely on Andrew Walker, who some of you will know, who sadly passed away earlier this year. He was a Pentecostal turned Orthodox Christian, son of a Pentecostal pastor, who was at King's College for much of his career and basically pioneered an approach to religious sociology in a very journalistic sort of style. I came across him when I was in the, what's been called the house church movement, which he was an expert on. He wrote the definitive book about that particular independent charismatic stream within British Christianity. In 1995, he wrote this essay about harmful religion, and it coincided with some sessions that he did with the late Tom Smale and also a Baptist minister, Nigel Wright, about the charismatic movement. And they did a session called the power of love, or the love of power, or the power of love. And they addressed sort of systemic issues around there, which had quite an impact at that time. So he knew what he was talking about, and he took a very balanced approach. So these are sort of summary of thoughts. Apparently, President Eisenhower insisted that the USA should be driven by religion, but he didn't care what religion it was. Now Walker says, that's daft. You can have bad religion as well as good religion. Religion in and of itself isn't necessarily a good thing. It can legitimate war and genocide, as well as sanction the moral values of a civilized society. And the history of Christianity in particular is one of murder as well as martyrdom, unfortunately. And he quotes a chap called Christopher Fitzsimmons Allison, who's referred to the cruelty of heresy, the idea that heresy or wrong belief in and of itself can be harmful, but equally we've seen cruelty to heretics. The church has been guilty of that. So he was writing in the mid-90s, and there were plenty of examples at that time of religious conflict in former Yugoslavia, where there was wrongdoing and ethnic cleansing on all sides, Northern Ireland, and there was also these wacky US millennial militias at that time as well. And more recently, recently, of course, sadly, we've seen jihadist Islam and also the current war in Ukraine. So these things don't go away, but they can also happen at a local level. We're all familiar with backbiting and strife that breaks out in parishes and congregations from time to time. But also there's darker issues about how church leaders relate to the power structures of the secular world. It's an interesting point, and how they can sometimes harm their flocks rather than feed them. You know, he focuses in his essay on a particular case from the 1990s, which some of you may have heard of, which was the 9 o'clock service in the Anglican Diocese of Sheffield, where some very serious sexual and spiritual abuse emerged that bypassed the diocesan authorities. There was also, interestingly, some theological deviancy in there, and that they embraced a kind of new agey creation spirituality associated with a guy called Matthew Fox, who was a American Episcopalian priest. And it was strange that this happened in an otherwise quite conservative Anglican diocese. And according to Walker, the danger signs were already there before they went down that more sort of new agey style and approach. And that even though there'd been positive influence early on, for some reason, things began to get very, very dodgy indeed. Just as an aside, I mean, I was talking to, actually the Sunday I was chrismated, I was talking to a Pentecostal couple who were describing some very wacky things that were going on in a church that they knew of. And a chap there who's been brought up Orthodox, he said, well, I can't understand this. How can that be allowed to happen? And I said, well, it's like the illustration that's often given about a frog and a saucepan. If you put a boiling hot saucepan on a hob and drop a frog in it, it'll immediately jump out. If you put the frog in the water when it's cool and gradually heat it up, it doesn't notice, and eventually the poor thing will boil to death. So these things often happen quite innocently and then develop and get out of hand, and that's certainly what's happened at the 9 o'clock service. And whilst he highlights that theological pluralism, some very vague kind of muddy kind of belief, was partly to blame, but also, as we all know, theological orthodoxy is no guarantee of harmless religion. Now, this interesting thing, I can speak from a conservative Protestant background, it can be moralistic on sexual and ethical standards, but equally it cannot overlook theological deviancy, which is in and of itself harmful. And what Walker cites there is a 1990 study by the British Council of Churches on the Forgotten Trinity, which argued that a misshapen theology can in itself cause harm. A lot of it can be down to a lopsided view of the Trinity. You can get, if you have too much father, as it were, you get a repressive patriarchal approach. Too much Holy Spirit, you get a charismatic triumphalism, or you can have a sort of sloppy mentalism, lovely cuddly Jesus that trivializes the sacred, too much sun. And that's a bit of a caricature, but I think there's a lot of truth in that. But the main point is, sadly, there's no automatic link between orthodoxy and orthopractice, between right believing and right living. And there's two dangers that he highlights. One is a academic and theologically correct approach that can lead to legalism, and also anything, and I think this is key, anything that interferes with human dignity and freedom. I think if we see things that begin to interfere with that, that's when the alarm bells start ringing. Okay, he then goes on to describe two models that have been used to sort of study and tackle and address religious harm. And the first one, and both of them developed in the US. The first one is what he calls the addiction model. And that came out of, I don't know if people are old enough to remember, but TV evangelist scandals in the 1980s. And as a result of that, there were groups like Fundamentalist Anonymous that emerged, and they offered 12-step programs based on the Alcoholics Anonymous model that you might be familiar with. And as a general overview, they considered that symptoms, if you like, of religious harm were compulsive and excessive church attendance. And Walker cites an instance of a priest who said this, and I've come across it as well, of clergy people, clergy men, clergy women, who've had to actually discourage certain people from coming to church because they're overdosing on it. You know, they're going a bit over the top at church, you know, and neglecting their own sort of way of life and their own responsibilities. Another one is an inability to think, doubt, or question authority. An inability for people to work things out for themselves, i.e. the church authorities or the pastors or whoever it is, elders, priests, sort of say they know best. You don't work out for yourself, I can tell you what's right. Also a shame-based belief that you aren't good enough for God or that you can't do things right. And finally, a magical worldview in which God will fix everything for you. You've only got to believe hard enough. So those are generally the features of that kind of harmful religion. Now, that approach has got various pros and cons. Firstly, it should be taken seriously, Walker believes, because using, as it were, in the drug sense, using religion like drugs is a substitute for coping with real life and a toxin in the spiritual bloodstream. Church can become not a place of sanctuary, but a source of sickness rather than a place of healing, a place of addiction rather than abundance. And this model does fit with pastoral as well as clinical experience, and treatment can be applied to individuals, families, and even whole congregations where necessary. Those are the plus bits about this model. The downside are things that it doesn't take into account, and in particular, and I've certainly come across this too. It can be misused in some liberal theological circles to wean people off not only fundamentalist forms of religion, but towards open-ended replacements, which can themselves end up being quite illiberal. The question is a loss of faith an appropriate end to addiction? I was talking to a clinical psychologist I know a good while back now, who said that at one time the prevailing attitude and treatment that was taken of people who had religious delusions, say, or were in abusive church settings, was to get them out of any belief system whatsoever, and that was harmful. What they tend to do now is to tend to steer people into sort of perhaps a more moderate form or another form of belief, but not take them out of the belief system itself, which is a bit of a change in the way that secular therapies have begun to go. But also, what the problem with this approach can turn the spotlight onto the victim rather than those who are perpetrating the abuse, which could be priests, elders, those invested with authority, or those who simply take authority upon themselves. So it deals with some of the problems, but not the whole thing. Now, the second model that he looks at is one called the abuse of power and misuse of authority, which looks at the more systemic aspects in structures, in church structures, organizational structures. And that's the love of power or the power of love. And this is about the abuse of power in church settings. 3 features to commend it. It's thoroughly compatible with Christian theology. It doesn't necessarily involve any kind of therapeutic techniques or anything that comes from outside of a Christian paradigm. And it also forces us to look at mainstream and historic Christianity and not just cults and sects. And these issues, abuse of power, can apply to monasteries and covenanted communities, because the line between saints and fanatics can be very thin. Okay, and it can also help us by concentrating on the institutional structures that, rather than individual members, individual cases, can encourage the moral virtues of stewardship, responsibility, and accountable leadership. And in addition, it looks at the spiritual fruits of repentance, restitution, which may be more faithful to the gospel than therapeutic and counseling methodologies when combating religious addiction. Okay, so those are the 2 models. Some pros and cons with the first, with the second model. positive that it looks at structures and systemic issues rather than individual victims. It can also be more corporate than individualistic. And importantly, it challenges abusers rather than simply helping those who've been abused. Now, the thing we need to watch with this model is to work properly. It needs careful handling with an objective application of evidence and facts. Otherwise, we end up with judgmentalism. We pointing out motes in other people's eyes and ignoring beams in our own. The other important issue here is harmful religion is not religion that is not to our taste. Just because we don't like it ourselves doesn't necessarily mean it's harmful. Just because we think something might be mistaken in its beliefs, and yes, it's true that heresy is spiritually harmful, we have to be clear that harm is being done. So for instance, you could pick up something like fasting or circumcision in the Jewish community and other ritual practices that are normative, and you could make a judgment, say, well, that's harmful, without taking into account the context, the history there, the things that are norms within that particular community. So you have to be discerning in terms of identifying where potential harm is taking place. So we need strong discernment and understanding of the context. Okay, some conclusions here. Both those models, Walker argued, were complementary, and that the addiction model would appeal to those who would seek to apply healing and holistic approaches to help the individual. And the abusive model, or tackling the abusive model, would appeal to those seeking reparation and justice and making sure that systems change and that things don't go on in future. The Lord Jesus Christ both healed the sick and bound up the brokenhearted, but also condemned the oppressive religious leaders of his day. And there's the quote from Matthew 18:6-7. Whosoever shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, that he were drowned in the sea. Woe unto the world because of his offences. It must need be that offences come, but woe to that man by whom the offence cometh. So there's a both and thing going on. There's both individual responsibility and also the corporate and organisational aspect that needs to be looked at and challenged where necessary. So that's basically a summary of Walker's argument, both in his essay, and it was also the one that he used in the workshops and conferences that he did at that time in the mid-90s. Now, I'm not going to offer necessarily any answers here, because I'd like to throw it open for discussion, but there's just a few my own observations and questions here. And the first one, and it isn't to freak us out or scare us, is that as with democracy, as with freedom in society, constant vigilance is required. Who was it said that evil triumphs when good men do nothing? And abuse can happen anywhere and at any time, and it isn't the preserve of wacky, weird and wonderful cults and sects. It can happen in mainstream and historic churches as well. Only the other week I was talking to an Anglican clergywoman who told me about some very egregious spiritual abuse that had happened in a sort of spiritual direction, one-to-one spiritual direction context, if you're familiar with that concept. And I won't say which diocese she was in, but for a long time the bishop and the diocesan authorities ignored this, wouldn't have it. In the end, she pressed the case, won the case, and she got some reparation out of them in that they paid for her to go on a course all about contemplative prayer and all the things that she was very much into. But her point was that there was initially at least a kind of a reluctance and a refusal within that particular diocese to tackle this issue. They just wanted to draw a veil over it. That can happen anywhere. That can happen in Catholic settings, it can happen in Orthodox settings, it can happen in Protestant settings, it can happen in any religion, not just within Christianity. So the question is, how can we minimize systemic abuse and make sure that we neither fall victim to it or perpetrate it ourselves? And I think there's an issue here, particularly with those of us who might be keen on theology, keen to do things right, keen that we've got the right beliefs. If you're not careful, we can apply that in quite a bullying or aggressive way, which isn't the way of Christ. That doesn't mean that we should be all wishy-washy and ignore right belief, but it's the way that we deal that and the way that we deal with people. We have to be careful that we're not becoming abusive ourselves. There's also the issue, as everybody knows, that people who have been abused can become abusive themselves, and that can be seen in survivors, if you like, of abusive relationships. They can, people now perpetuate abuse, or they have a series of abusive relationships, and they get drawn into a repeated cycle unless that can be broken at some point. So the question is, how can we minimize abuse? How can we stop it happening at an institutional level? And how can we ensure that we neither fall victim to it ourselves or perpetrate it on other people? So that's essentially where I will draw a line under this and throw it over to discussion and debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. That was an admirable presentation, and there's so much there to reflect upon. Maybe, Philip, you could just review it again to see if you want to make any changes, and we can get that published as a transcript. Would you like to do that?
Possibly. Well, as we're quoting mostly, and most of the materials come from a published source, so as long as you give due credit to the source and so forth, that
perhaps you can revise it slightly and send it to me with the source, and I will promise that I will, make sure this is a fair use extract, and I'm sure the publishers will be fine with that. Anyway, I just my hand's just. Yeah, that's right. Okay, Philip, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to just keep that there so we can look at people who wish to speak. So, Katerina, would you like to speak? Or have you, I don't know, you've just come down as a, maybe not, you've just appeared as a speaker, but right, just use the little hand mechanism. Sorry, Katerina, I misread what you're doing. Just use the little hand mechanism or wave your hand if you would like to make a contribution. Ask Philip some questions, perhaps about those models and the pros and the cons of using each. How do we create healthy Christian cultures in which we're vigilant against spiritual abuse, but also create the conditions in which it is less likely to happen?
I think Judith wants to speak.
Sorry, Judith. Yes, thank you. You need to unmute, Judith.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's all right.
There's got to be one person in every Zoom call, hasn't there? But I've done it. I've taken one for the team. Really enjoyed that. That was really thoughtful, really helpful. And I can see how those models, the systemic one and the individual one, do sit together. I worked on a sermon a couple of months ago explicitly about safeguarding and the theological basis for safeguarding, built quite a lot around Proverbs 31:8, but not exclusively that. And the feedback from the sermon was really interesting in that some people absolutely got it, but there were other people that didn't kind of want to name abuse in a church context, and there was almost a sort of shock horror. You can't use the word abuse in relation to the church, but I think it's quite important to name it, because otherwise we can't, create a safe environment. We can't create, play our role in creating God's kingdom on earth without kind of acknowledging these things. So yeah, I just want to say that, but it was super presentation. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Can I just ask, I used to be a walking concordance, but my memory isn't so good these days. But what Proverbs 31:8, what's that reference?
So Proverbs 31:8, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy.
Mm. And the 31:8 reference is an Christian, ecumenical Christian organisation that provides safeguarding services to the churches, of which this parish and our diocese are members.
Yeah, really good organisation, and they are the secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group that's looking at spiritual abuse, religious abuse, abuse within a church context. So an organisation that's worth keeping an eye on.
I think if I could come back to that, Father Gregory, I think one of the things about the systemic issue that we have to watch is I'm of the view that certain systems are not reformable, by which I mean the abuse is built in. I'll give you an example. I won't name names, but I remember a leader of an independent charismatic church telling me about a conference he'd been to, led by another particular pastor within that sort of stream, if you like, who actually gave an example of what he does in order to sort of control malcontents and people who might be griping within his congregation. And without going into the detail, it was almost KGB stuff. You know, he would have spies in the house group who would report back. And he gave this instance of a guy who had was causing a few waves within the church with a bit of a dissenting voice, and he developed an addiction to internet pornography. And when he went and told his house group leader about this, the guy went and told the elders about this. They had him there, and they say, right, you either leave the church now and stop rocking the boat, or we'll tell everybody about your addiction to internet pornography.
Oh, great.
And that, I mean, blackmail, and this, I mean, it makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck telling you about it. And he gave this as an example of how things should be handled, and he got a laugh. And the bloke who was at the conference said he was appalled, and it wasn't challenged at all. This was presented as if this was a legitimate Christian way of dealing with an issue like that.
Oh,
you know,
goodness.
threatening to expose somebody. Now that is just horrific. Now I would say in an instance like that, no amount of intervention, no amount of counselling or well-meaning models could resolve a situation like that, because to me that just says that church setup is completely and utterly abusive in every way, even to consider behaving in that kind of way. Now I'm deliberately using a very extreme example there, but it shows how people can take on things like that and justify them and make them as part of their modus operandi.
If that situation isn't reformable in the sense that it's systemic to systems and structures, how do you dismantle it and rebuild something healthy?
I don't think you can. I just think it'd be wise for people to leave a setting like that and go elsewhere. I can't think of any other way of dealing with it unless there was repentance and a change of heart and a change of methodology among the leaders.
So it would take that. I mean, that would be possible if there was. I think the trouble is that one of the weaknesses of the independent church model is that there is no oversight beyond the congregation.
Yeah. Well, there can be, but sometimes the people are giving the oversight.
But it's a very weak connection with an X, a very weak associational model, in which there always has to be oversight. I think anyway, that there should always be some sort of pastoral oversight, checks and balances at every level of authority within any religious organization. And I'm making it clear this isn't limited to Christianity, because without that, things can be done under the veil, under the cloak of darkness, or through threats and intimidation, through blackmail, as you suggested. Yeah, I just want to say at this point that it may be that one or two people who are Orthodox Christians may be thinking, oh, well, that, you know, it doesn't happen with us. You know, we're not independent charismatics. I'd just like to take, Phil, if I may, just 5 minutes to just give some examples of how it has happened with us and what the implications might be. Is that okay? Right, okay. And I want to refer to, in an Orthodox Christian context, particular problems in our tradition. The first being micromanaging people's lives. Now, you will actually come across this in other house church traditions and other places. It's not just in Orthodoxy, but I think that it is a vulnerability that we have. So I put here, it's not the just so-called heavy shepherding, as it's called, of cultic Protestantism, but also in the Orthodox examples of the same, immature and or power-hungry spiritual fathers who are, to quote scripture, ravenous wolves to the flock rather than true shepherds, by getting a kick of requiring their spiritual children to get a blessing for every little decision that they might make in life. I once met a Russian Orthodox lay nursing sister in Moscow, who's a well-educated woman, who solemnly told me that once that she needed to ask a blessing from her spiritual father, that's her spiritual guide, for the purchase of a new washing machine to replace her worn-out old model. I mean, I mention this, of course, because it might do well to remind people that the Orthodox, in respect of spiritual guides and fathers and spiritual mothers as well, are not immune from this kind of spiritual abuse, micromanaging people's lives to the point of saying that you're a sinner, you're violating God's loving relationship with you if you get that new washing machine because you're being materialistic, and so on and so forth. Exorcisms, again, not limited to Orthodoxy, but here I'm going to give you an example that merge into violence. Many will remember the examples of some Pentecostal preachers beating the devil out of young children and being approved in this by their parents, who were convinced that persistent naughtiness was evidence of demonic possession. Perhaps less well known is the case of a Romanian nun, Maricia Irene Coricchi, I'm sorry, Anna Maria, if I pronounced that incorrectly, who was violently exorcised and then died after being bound to a cross, gagged, and left alone for 3 days in a cold room in a convent. The priest involved in the exorcism, Father Daniel Correagianu, together with 4 nuns who assisted him, were convicted and jailed for 7 years. Now, that might be an extreme and exceptional case, but how an exorcism is done, with which there are clear guidelines in the Orthodox Church, are not always observed. 3, conversion therapies. The government plans to draw up legislation to be announced in the Queen's next speech to ban conversion therapies aimed at changing a person's sexuality, widely condemned by the medical profession as abusive and psychologically damaging. Controversially, it has left out a blanket ban on such therapies for transgender people seeking gender reassignment. These cases of damaging interventions in persons conflicted over their sexuality or gender has often a predominantly religious component to it, although there is also a cultural dimension in more conservative communities that may not have a religious dimension. Many conservative Christian groups have opposed the proposed legislation here in the UK. And I referenced in my transcript an article recently in the Church Times. Cyprus, an Orthodox country, is, from my point of view at least, commendably about to ban such conversion therapies as well, on account of the abuse perpetrated by some Orthodox practitioners of these therapies on the island of Cyprus, leading in some of these cases to tragic suicides. 4, and finally, the reinforcement of neurosis through a toxic image of God. this is much more difficult to document, but in my 12 years of ministry as an Anglican priest, and then 27 years ministry as an Orthodox priest, I have ministered to a large number of people over these 39 years who have suffered under the heavy hand of confessors and spiritual counselors who have enforced their toxic images of a vengeful and wrathful God upon their tender consciences. A particularly egregious example of this in an Orthodox context, all too often encountered, encountered are penitents, commonly called scrupulous, who've been encouraged into believing by these confessors that unless they remember and recount every single sin they have committed since their last confession, some of these are not being sins at all, in fact, then they will not be forgiven. So you've got to remember absolutely everything, else, you know, you're endangering your soul. Of course, this is heresy, impure and complex, not pure and simple. That's the opposite, isn't it? Impure and complex. No wonder Freud became convinced of his atheism, trying to heal his profoundly neurotic, often religious patients in Vienna in his practice. Meanwhile, and this is perhaps particularly for this gentleman if he's watching, meanwhile, I am dealing with an Orthodox gentleman on Facebook who does not believe that we should, quote, wash our dirty linen in public. But of course, unless we are prepared to confess our dirty linen in public, how shall we be washed? For public accountability, as well as accountability before God, is required of us. Are we to wait until the long arm of the law and then public contempt defeats us? Maybe that won't happen and we can cover it all up. We all know where that leads. No, we have to diagnose the disease and cure it for the sake primarily of the victims, both past, present, and God forbid, those potential victims in the future. So please, Orthodox Christians watching and listening to this, do not think it couldn't possibly happen here, because it has and it does. Back to you, Phil.
Okay. Just thinking where we go next.
Reactions perhaps to what I've said?
Yeah. I think there's an issue around, I think a lot of these things can be good in and of themselves, but can be abused or taken to an extreme. So I think anything, one of the things I said in the presentation about anything that sort of detracts away from human dignity and the sort of the integrity of the individual Christian soul, we have to be wary of. And I think secrecy is an issue. I mean, that was certainly what happened with the 9 o'clock service. They were very secretive about what was going on, wouldn't let people scrutinize. And the diocesan authorities there didn't want to interfere. They didn't want to interfere with religious freedom. And so a lot of this stuff was going on without them knowing. Some of it, I would say, is probably hidden in plain sight, and they could have dealt more decisively earlier than they did. But the thing that springs to mind to me then is the confessional, confession within Orthodoxy and within Catholicism and Anglo-Catholicism. That could be, it's a legitimate practice, but it could be open to abuse. How do we deal with practices which are perhaps fine in and of themselves, but can have a cloak of secrecy around them, and then they become distorted and perverted and become abusive? I'd be interested in your views on that.
Can I just say something quickly about that? In the Orthodox Church, anyone who is going to be a confessor in their parish has to be trained. In the Greek tradition, you don't usually get to be a confessor and hear people's confessions for at least 2 years after ordination to the priesthood. And during that 2-year period, but usually longer, a senior priest, a mature, well-respected confessor, maybe the parish priest, maybe someone else, will take that person on board and train him usually through case studies. What would you do in this kind of a situation? All anonymized, but based on fact, usually. How would you handle this? Because one of the most important guiding points for confessors in the Orthodox tradition is that whatever you say must be conducive to that person's salvation, which begs a lot of questions. But it does emphasize that we should not bruise people in the acquisition of salvation. We should be a healing. I mean, one of the prayers that the confessor says in the, in introducing confession is, "I am only a witness, bearing testimony before him of all the things you shall say unto me." In other words, that the confession is directed to Christ. But this training, I think, does go a long way, provided it takes place, to excluding bad practices. What was your other point? Sorry, Philip. You were.
I think it was about. Yeah, how do we? Yeah, I think you've answered your question a bit with confession, but sort of if things that could become secretive and.
Oh, secretive. Yeah. Obviously, there has to be confidentiality, and of course, in the terms of the seal of the confessional, absolute confidentiality. I take those secrets, so to speak, to my grave. But there has to be a clear understanding about that which is confidential and that which cannot be confidential. And of course, this is a spiritual, pastoral and legal minefield, which the independent inquiry on spiritual abuse, what's the proper title? Independent inquiry on child sexual abuse has had to grapple with, that in the Anglo-Catholic, Catholic and Orthodox traditions, this absolute secrecy of the confessional could sometimes be leading to a situation. The abuse of that could be leading to a situation whereby crimes continue to be perpetrated on the innocent and nothing is done about it. But one other thing, I think the things who may not know a lot about our traditions in respect to confession is that the priest does not have to give absolution. Okay? Mm. So if somebody comes along with a sin which has a criminal aspect, a confessor must withdraw or withhold rather absolution, which presumably the penitent actually wants, else they wouldn't be there at confession, until that person has reported him or herself to the authorities. They're not going to get absolution from me if a criminal act has been committed. They first have to go to the authorities. Now, if they're not prepared to do that, they don't get absolution. If they really want and value absolution in salvation terms, they condemn themselves because they're saying, I don't want salvation because I think that salvation has nothing to do with the law. Now, if they really think that, then what the priest learns from that failure in respect, I suppose, of the guide of a person's soul is, am I teaching people that the law really does matter? You may think that it might not happen here, but that kind of false idea, which is based on the idea that the church is somehow separated from the world and therefore not contaminated in some kind of way, is a matter for a teacher, a preacher, a minister of any religion to actually grapple with and say, the church is, it may not be of the world, but it is in the world, and it's in a fallen world, you know, and the wheat and the tares grow together, using Jesus's parable. And there will be tares in our congregations. And the wheat and the tares thing, of course, is the divide that's within us as well. There but the grace of God go I. That is the kind of spirit that provides a context, I think, for a healthy Christian approach to the care of vulnerable people in any community, but not the idea that it couldn't happen here. And just like Judith was saying earlier, you know, in your example, Judith, Helen and I, she's sitting here, she don't want to be seen, but Helen, you will agree with this, won't you? No matter how many times we say it, still lurking underneath in some congregations is this persistent idea that it couldn't happen here. Either it's because people don't want to look at this thing because it's too upsetting, or they genuinely believe that if you're a Christian, you're not going to do this stuff. I must be quiet now. I've
Judith's
talked too
got a
long.
hand up. Have you got a point? Is that a what they
Judith.
call a legacy hand, or is it?
No. I was going to say something else, if that's okay. I think you both, Philip and Father Gregory, made some really good points. And I think the point about training and reflective practice, so going over case studies, what would you do, that kind of thing, is a really important aspect of making sure that we put in place what we can in terms of good governance, I guess I would call it, those systems and processes to try and minimize the chances of things happening. So, you know, governance, good governance, accountability, transparency within what we've just said. There are some things that are absolutely confidential, but there are some things where we're required morally and under the law to disclose, and we need to explain to people beforehand. But I think all these kind of things help address that situation that Philip was talking about earlier, where the system or the institution has kind of got out of whack, and it's not doing, you know, it's, I can't think of words, but
it's part of the problem, not the solution.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kevin's got his hand up as well, I think.
Kevin.
Yeah, I found it really interesting what you were saying, Philip, and there was so much I couldn't hold it all in my head, because in all the examples you gave, I was thinking, yeah, seen it. And I can't remember, there was, you said abuse, and there was the other one. What was the other one you said?
Well, it's the addiction model
Addiction.
and the the abusive structure model.
Yeah, I think they're both, I can see them both.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it was interesting, you know, what Father Gregory was saying, you know, when he was saying about, you know, about churches, you know, accepting that they're in the world and not separate from it. And I think that's a major part of healing, because I think it's like when you see yourself being separate of it, I think that's when the danger comes in, like, I'm a Christian and I'm not part of the world, I'm better than everybody else. And you may not admit to thinking like that, but the result of, you know, seeing yourself as separate from the world can lead to that. And I think it's like a misunderstanding of what Christ taught us. Absolutely. As well. And I think that there can be too much emphasis on the institution, because I think if you focus on the institution, you forget about everything else. And I think that this is something which is multi-level. Yeah. I think it's life itself, you know, which is multi-level. It's at the institutional level, it's at the individual level, it's about, you know, the abuse happens within the walls of the church, it happens outside it happens in the family, you know, which is also a church. You know, every family is a church, but you get abuse within that as well, abuse within relationships, you know, people having, you know, partners having their idea, their fantasy as to what the religion is. And then they impose that on the people within their world, and their world is within their family, you know, their boyfriends, whatever, girlfriends, whatever. And so they have this, you know, strange interpretation, which they will not accept is, you know, anybody else's. And I think you've got it again, as you're saying, with the priests. I mean, being a priest is like in a position of, wow, you know, all these people, you know, respecting you. And within the people, it's what do the people want from their priest? You know, do they see their priest as being some sort of Superman that they can project all their ideas onto, whether that priest really is that or not? You know, and use that, and then the priest, you know, in this world can lose his position and feeling and become all the things you were saying, you know, and like the power. You know, I think as we see with what's happening with somebody we'll know about on the news at the moment, you know, there's that old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think it just shows you that we're in a really difficult place. And yeah, and everything that Christ was saying about the old religion, you know, about what was happening in the temple, you could look and you could say, that's happening now. That's happening now. And I think it's like really dangerous. And I think, you know, what is the answer to this? Where it's really difficult. But I think what one has to do.
I mean, Kevin, if I may interrupt, it's in the gospel we had last Sunday in the Orthodox Church. Which Peter, yeah, with John and James, sons of Zebedee, wanted to sit, you know, at Christ's right hand in the kingdom, this, that, the other. Can you drink the cup with which I am baptized? But then, of course, the double whammy that Christ offers in that teaching, and in order to reconcile the disciples to each other, is the insistence that preeminence in the kingdom of God is servanthood.
Yeah,
it's washing feet.
yeah.
You know, that's the only kind of power that is legitimate to any Christian, let alone a priest. The respect that we have must be through service, through self-sacrifice, not through being the fount of all knowledge and the person who will, you know, wade into a situation as some sort of spiritual guru, you know, or some sort of spiritual fixer. And just, you know, or, you know, if I get the priest to come and bless my house, this is ridiculous. You know, if I get a priest to come and bless my house, then nothing bad's going to happen, because he's some sort of shaman, like the tribes, the animistic tribes, a shaman of protection against evil. You know, that is where the priest has to be properly trained. The minister has to be properly trained. I don't want to interrupt you all along, Kevin, but with Phil's permission, carry on.
Can I just come in with a point there, please, Father Gregory?
Yeah.
It's just, I think as well, we need to remind ourselves that these things aren't even just exclusive to religious communities. I mean, for my sins, I'm involved in local politics, and all the things that you're talking about now, I've seen happen within particular political parties. I think it can happen within and any political party, right, left, centre, not you know, making any party political judgment there. I think it can happen anywhere where there's strong belief or strong ideology or strong common cause can go wonky if we're not careful. And I think, you know, I mean, we spoke about an issue earlier from the independent sort of church sector. I mean, I was talking the other day to a woman who was brought up in the Salvation Army in the 1950s, and by no means knocking the Sally Army now. Everybody loves the Sally Army. They do good. They, you know, trumpets and, you know, brass bands on the streets and all that stuff. But growing up in it, particularly in the 1950s, it was pretty heavy. And she said, you know, they have the penitent form, you know, if you're aware, yeah, that where, you know, there's a big emphasis on repentance and public repentance, and sinners, yeah, sinners would be invited to come and kneel at the penitent form. It was part of the kind of revivalist sort of thing that William Booth was part of. But she said she's seen that with teenage girls who'd become pregnant, having to confess to the whole congregation what they'd done. And I've seen an example of that in a church I was involved with, a couple, you know, that had to get in front of the church and tell everybody what they'd done and how she'd fallen pregnant and how, you know, they had to get married. And, you know, everybody was really, really embarrassed. Yet that was what the elders made them do. And, you know, going back in Wales, you're very strong within the sort of chapel culture in South Wales where I grew up, that sort of thing. Not so much within living or my, you know, but you don't have to go that far back, Scotland as well, and very Calvinistic Presbyterian churches, they'd have them up in front and shame them. You know, this person has sinned, they're going to tell the whole congregation about it. Now, that doesn't happen within an Orthodox context, because the confession is to the priest on behalf of, you know, not the entire body of believers that are gathered there.
I mean, that's why we dropped public confession.
Yeah.
You know, about the 4th, 5th century. That's why
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, you've asked me. So how do you deal with a situation like that where an abusive practice, in my view, had become systemic and was expected, and they saw nothing wrong in this? They thought they were doing these people a favor by getting them to confess publicly. But imagine having to go through an ordeal like that, just doesn't bear thinking about. So I suppose that on one level, we're talking about, this is where the right belief comes in, and changing practices that are out of sync. But the other thing is to be vigilant about practices that we may agree with and may espouse, but which are perhaps neutral or good in and of themselves, but can be distorted by abuse rather than right use. And I think that's
that's a very, very good distinction. Yeah.
I think, like, have you seen the film? I'm not sure of the name, but I think there's a film called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit.
Oh yeah. There was a novel and a TV program, set in a Pentecostal setting in Lancashire,
And that's I think that's a really good film to watch because it looks at all these issues.
Yeah.
I think another thing is, like, things don't have to be open. Things can be underhand as well. People can gossip. So churches are great places for gossip. And I think that can also be a problem. I mean, what you were saying, I've had to change my perspective because, I don't feel happy at the moment in physically going to church. First of all, there was the stuff with COVID, and I didn't agree with the attitude of the churches I went to on both political ground and also religious grounds. And I didn't feel comfortable there. And also the reaction I got from some people with messages being sent to me about how, I was how getting vaccinated was against Christ and a sin and the rest of it, and how, the CIA had chips that were going to enter your body with it all, and all of this cause nonsense. And being sent all this stuff, it just put me off. I just thought,
not surprised.
I can't go back there. I just put me off at all. Yeah, completely. And it's a shame, but that's how I feel. And now with all of this stuff in Ukraine, and having experienced what it was like in the church in 2014 with the division and the splits and things, I just don't want any part of that now, because that's not what church is all about, for me anyway.
Right.
So
now, it's 8:30, folks. I'm going to have to say sorry, that's it. I'm just going to close for 2 or 3 minutes with some resources, okay? So here is the first resource. So am I full screen with everybody? If you just go into speaker mode, can you see this? It's TOV, T-O-V, Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses of Power and Promotes Healing. It's called A Church Called TOV by Scott McKnight. Now, if you go to the 31.8, which Judith has referred to before, 31, all one word, is that right?
Yeah.
Colon, E-I-G-H-T, 31.8. This book is very good. It shows how a healthy Christian culture, church culture, can be developed, and to avoid the systemic as well as individual and personal abuses that take place within any given church community. I'm just going to share the screen now. Just bear with me a moment. I hope you can see it. Yeah, so here we go. Share. Right, can you all see abuse, escaping the maze of spiritual abuse? Can you see that? Yeah, just say yes, please. That's
Yes,
all.
yes, we can.
Okay, so this is a book which has been written by one of the senior folks at 31/8, Dr. Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys, Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse. I've got this from Amazon, as you can see. If you want to just take a note of it, if you want, the Kindle edition is only £4.74 and it's in stock. Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse is a very, very good book, much like TOV, but looking at different factors. Also 31/8, and I will make sure you've all got access to this resource after this session in some way. Probably sent you by email. 31/8 do webinars on various topics, one of which is spiritual abuse. And this is the landing page of one of them. Helen, my wife here, organizes this training in our diocese. It's required on all church workers who've got contact with children or adults at risk of harm. And the second one, this is, I don't know if you can read this, I hope you can. Module 1, Understanding Spiritual Abuse. What is spiritual abuse? Who are the perpetrators and where does it happen? What are the key characteristics of spiritual abuse? Module 2, Understanding the Impact. What are the different impacts of spiritual abuse? How can an experience affect faith? 3, responding well to spiritual abuse. How to respond well, the importance of policy and procedure, pathways for referral. And module 4, this is where we get into the really positive stuff at creating a healthy culture, characteristics of a healthy Christian culture. This is very much the book on TOV, that's at emphasis, being part of that culture and looking to the future. Because what we want to do, I'm sure we all agree here, in our various Christian communities of different traditions, is create by the wisdom of God and the grace of God and true compassion and justice for the oppressed and for the needy and the poor. Proverbs 31:8. We want to create by the grace of God that Christian culture that will make it less likely that egregious examples of spiritual abuse and other forms of abuse take place. Not that it is a guarantee, because as all the speakers have here said, vigilance, vigilance in a careful, compassionate, pastoral way. Was it Churchill, price of freedom is eternal vigilance. This is right at the heart of the Christian gospel, that we be agents of healing, not of violence, of the suppression of all that is truly human, but rather that through us and in Christ, the human might flourish. Okay. Bit of a preachy end, but I think we can all look forward perhaps to making some incremental change or positive change in our various communities to help make that happen. Thank you very much for your attendance, everyone, this evening. This will be a recording on my YouTube channel and also on my Facebook timeline in about an hour's time. And I will find a way of getting the resources that we've shared with one another this night to you by email. And I'll have a conversation with Philip about how it might be done, respecting copyright of the source that he has used. Does anyone want to say anything very quickly before we shut down, just by way of something very quick?
Fantastic session, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Judith. I think everybody, and particularly Phil and the rest of us, have worked very hard to make that happen. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Father.
Yeah. Now, we're not going to meet again now until after Easter, after Pascha. And then the next Zoom session will be on the first Tuesday in May. That's the 3rd of May, God willing. So if you've got a good topic for us to examine, with one of you perhaps introducing it, then please let me know. Thanks very much, everybody. I'll say bye-bye for now. And God bless you and take care of yourselves. All right. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where do I stop it? Stop share. There we go. I can stop it now. End meeting. Bye-bye.